In this presentation, we'll discuss the concepts of democracy and constitutional democracy. And necessarily by implication, we'll have to have a brief look at electoral systems. But let's start with democracy. It is important to understand that there is no singular, uniformly, universally accepted idea of what democracy is. Democracy is a contested concept. When you think about democracy in the context of South Africa, it is important to bear in mind that part of the struggle against apartheid was the struggle for democracy. But what was that struggle for? And when we talk about democracy in this course and in the context of constitutional law, what do we mean by democracy? Even though there are so many different conceptions, and in the book by Friedman and De Vos, you will see they discuss various forms of democracy, which I want you to take a look at. But the essence, the core of democracy is that decisions which impact on members of a political society are to be taken by those people. So in other words, people have to take decisions for themselves, or alternatively, decisions that impact upon them must be taken by their elected representatives. So very broadly speaking, it is, when we talk about democracy, we talk about governance by the people, or at least at the behest of the people on their authority. But there are different conceptualizations of democracy, and for our purposes there are particularly two conceptualizations that are particularly important and that feature in the South African Constitution. Now I'm going to go through these one by one, and then when we discuss this in class, we can look at this closer, particularly as a result of questions that you may have. Let's start with representative democracy. Representative democracy simply means that people participate in governance through their elected representatives. I think you will agree with me that it would be totally impossible if, say, there are 15 million South Africans and say half of them are eligible to vote. There are 25 million of us who would want to participate in governance. All 25 million of us cannot be political role players in the sense that we are office bearers, in the sense that we make policy through our involvement in the executive, and in the sense that we make laws, that we all have to reach an agreement on what the content of law should be. So it's really quite a practical issue that, or a practical demand that necessitates us to accept representative democracy. Now, in any modern political system, the vehicle for participation is through political parties. And this is particularly acknowledged in the South African Constitution, that political parties play an important role in facilitation of governance. So political parties participate in democratic elections, in that they put forward policies and they compete for support among the electorate, who participates rather in elections at regular intervals. And the political party who then triumphs in the election has the right to form the government and then pursues its policies through legislation and through the implementation of its agenda. Now, perhaps it is here necessary to just pause very briefly and outline the major electoral systems that we find in the world, and this is something that I would like us to explore in more detail in lectures. Now, one gets constituency-based electoral systems, and what does that mean? Constituency means a geographical area. So you take a particular state, the territory of a state, you divide it in constituencies. So in other words, you say this particular district forms an electoral district. And within that particular electoral district, political parties then compete for support. Say it's the district of the Moon, for example. Let's keep it out of a particular state. On the Moon, there's the district, one electoral district, west quarter of the Moon. And then political party members of Party A and Party B, they will nominate people, individuals, Mr. X and Mr. Y, or Mrs. Y, who will participate in the election and who will compete against one another for support. So X and Y the human beings, the individuals. They represent the interests of the parties, and the electorate in the Western Quarter of the Moon will vote for X or Y. So they vote for a person. And that person, X or Y, who ultimately wins in a first past the post, in other words, who gets the most votes, doesn't matter how many people vote, but who gets the most votes, that person then represents the Western Quarter of the Moon in the legislature. Okay. Then you get a proportional representation system. And here, there are many variants thereof, but the basic, the essence of a proportional representation system is that you do not vote for an individual. So you don't vote for Mr. X or Mr. Y, but you vote for political party Z or political party C. So this means instead of me casting a vote for X, who is a member of a particular political party, I vote for the party. And the party wields quite significant power within the system of proportional representation. Prior to the election, the party is required to compile a list of people who will represent it in the legislature, should it be successful in the election. And if the party Z, gets 40% of the votes, it will have 40% of the members of that particular legislative body that the vote is for. So instead of me, a member of the electorate, a citizen, choosing I want Mr. A or Mrs. B or Mr. C to be my representative, I say I want Party Z to choose from their list a number of people in proportion to their votes to represent my interests. Can you see how the two systems differ? In a constituency-based system, you have a face to match with a particular geographical area. And I know my representative is Mr. X, and I can go to him and say, I'm not happy with this that is transpiring in my particular constituency. In a proportional system, people are also assigned to constituencies, but the electorate do not vote for people, but rather for parties representing particular policies. Now, the proportional system is the one that we use in South Africa, and this has been relatively controversial over the last 20 years that it's been in place, because the political mandate then vests in the party, and the party wields immense interest. And the Constitution, in fact, demands a proportional representation system, or a system loosely based on this, and we can explore that in our discussion in class in a little bit more detail. But representative democracy, to get back to the core concept that we are discussing, means that we as an electorate choose 400 people who will make laws for us, because it is impossible for us to participate 25 million people in the lawmaking process directly. But if we were to reduce democracy to participation in elections, I think you will agree with me, our participation in elections once every 5 years actually means not that much. To vote, the court said in the case of August, is a badge of citizenhood, and it's a recognition of your autonomy and your dignity as a person. But if we exercise this vote once every 5 years, it can mean that, or it may mean that in the end we are quite powerless in the direction of policy making or lawmaking in our society. So participatory democracy, which is definitely also envisioned in the South African Constitution, requires that citizens be given a reasonable opportunity to involve themselves in decision making regarding governance. So, for example, when there is legislation on the table in Parliament, this is advertised widely to the public, and the public is given an opportunity to make representations to Parliament, whether in person or in writing, in an attempt to influence that process, so that my participation in the democratic process is not reduced to making a cross once every 5 years, but that my participation requires a reasonable opportunity furthermore to try and influence the legislative process, to say, I hear what you are proposing, but what about this? What is important for our purposes is that we have to bear in mind that representative and participatory democracy are not two competing, mutually exclusive concepts. As I've said right at the beginning, democracy is a contested concept, and we have to have a composite understanding of these different forms of democracy existing together to acknowledge our involvement and our importance as citizens in influencing the process of governance. The last concept that I want to discuss in this presentation is that of constitutional democracy. Now, constitutional democracy combines two facets. It combines the idea of constitutionalism, which we've discussed before, and democracy. And democracy, we've heard right at the beginning of this presentation, requires governance by the people. Constitutional democracy acknowledges that democracy is not about unbridled majority rule, because sometimes the majority wants strange things. If the majority of people are of the view that the death penalty is an acceptable form of punishment, or that abortion shouldn't be permitted, or that same-sex marriages should not be allowed, if we simply go by majority rule, I think you will agree with me that our human rights landscape in South Africa will look very different. And that is why our constitution, and that is why all over the world there's a recognition that democracy does not simply require giving expression to the will of the majority. But what we subscribe to is constitutional democracy. And that means we hear what the majority says, we follow the majority, but the majority has to act within constitutional bounds. So in other words, constitutional democracy means constrained, limited democracy within acceptable, agreed upon, justifiable constitutional bounds. So when the Constitution was adopted, the members of the polity agreed on a set standard, a normative framework within which governance has to take place. And that framework requires us to protect and uphold human rights, to respect free and fair elections, and to acknowledge the right of people to participate in those elections. And if the majority were to go against that, then we can say that there is not compliance with this concept of constrained and limited government that constitutionalism and constitutional democracy contains. Certain concepts, when we talk about constitutional democracy, are placed beyond the vicissitudes of the popular opinion. The popular opinion changes very regularly, but in governance we have to have some sort of stability. Unbridled and unconstrained majoritarianism can be oppressive, and it can be as oppressive as authoritarian dictatorship. We acknowledge the agency of each adult to make political decisions and to influence the political decision-making process. But we also recognize the lure of power and the fluidity of public opinion, and thus the necessity for embracing constitutional democracy. If you have any further questions regarding constitutional democracy, we can discuss this in class. Thank you.